Hi, welcome to our exam revision tutorial on suspense accounts. Our learning intentions today are to understand what a suspense account is used for, to prepare journal entries to correct errors, and to prepare a suspense account and adjusted profit and loss and balance sheet. First of all, we want to talk about what is a trial balance. A trial balance gives a list of all the account balances at the end of the accounting period. The debit side shows assets and expenses. The credit side shows liabilities and revenues. And anybody who's doing question 1 in the exam would be familiar with a trial balance. As in question 1, you're given a trial balance and you're asked to prepare a profit and loss and balance sheet. A trial balance should have the same total of debits and credits because under double entry bookkeeping, every debit should have a corresponding credit. So obviously at the end of the accounting period, your trial balance should balance and the debit and credit balances should be the same. Why does a suspense account arise? A suspense account arises due to errors in bookkeeping. The trial balance fails to balance and the difference between both sides is placed temporarily in a suspense account in the trial balance. So if debits and credits don't add up, the balancing figure is put into suspense, and then at a later date, the accountants would usually clear out the suspense account and put the figures into whatever accounts they should be in. So it's a temporary place where any a balance goes just to balance up your trial balance. So some errors are revealed by the trial balance and some errors are not revealed by the trial balance. The errors that are revealed by the trial balance are mathematical errors, simple errors in addition and subtraction, double entry errors, posting only one side of a double entry, because then obviously your trial balance won't balance. One side will be bigger than the other if you only post a one side entry. Misplaced entries, entering one amount on the debit side of one ledger account and entering a different amount on the credit side of another ledger account. So if you enter different amounts on the debit and credit side, obviously your journal won't balance, and that means your trial balance won't balance. So what errors are not revealed by the trial balance? So the 6 errors we're going to look at here. So these are mistakes, but you won't pick them up in the trial balance. Your trial balance will still balance, but it will contain these errors. So error of commission. This occurs when the correct amount is posted to the correct side of the incorrect account. So it's the correct amount and it's the correct side, but just the wrong account. So for example, goods sold on credit to Brian Smith, debited in error to Brendan Smith's account, so placed in the wrong account. Errors of original entry. These are errors made in the books of first entry, which are then subsequently posted to the appropriate ledger accounts. So something like the sales book or the purchases book. So for example, credit sales to Tom Brady for 334 were entered as 433 in the sales book and posted accordingly to both the sales account and the Brady's account. So they were entered in the correct accounts just for the wrong amount. They should have been 334 and were entered as 433. That won't be picked up in the trial balance as the debit and credit were both for the same amount, 433, but that amount was incorrect. Error of principal. An error of principal arises when an item is posted to the incorrect class of account. So for example, a shop owner purchased a vehicle and treated it as the purchase of stock. But if a shop owner purchases a vehicle, it shouldn't be treated as the purchase of stock. It should be put in as an asset under a motor vehicle. So he would have credited bank and debited purchases where he should have credited bank and debited your fixed asset. Compensating errors. This is where an error on the debit side of one account is compensated by an error of an equal amount on the credit side of another account. So for example, a cash payment of 700 for insurance entered as 70 in the debit side of the insurance account and on the credit side of the cash account. So again, they're put in the right accounts, but just the wrong amount. And so instead of it being 770 was placed on both sides, the debit and the credit, which means it would balance. You won't pick up in the trial balance, but again, it's an error. Error of omission. Transactions are completely left out of the ledger accounts and the final balance. Both debit and credit are omitted. So they're just completely left out. So if your trial balance balances, it'll still balance. You just haven't posted this journal at all. So it's obviously a mistake that was left out. So for example, a check for 2,000 paid by Jones for equipment has not been entered in the books. So they should have credited bank and debited equipment, and they didn't do that, which is wrong. Reversal of entries. This happens when the correct figures are used, but entries are made on the incorrect sides of the accounts involved, where the debit entry is on the credit side and the credit entry is on the debit side. It's posted to the wrong side of the accounts. So that means those individual accounts will be incorrect, even though your trial balance will still balance. So for example, the sale of goods to C. Casey for 500 was entered on the credit side of Casey's account. It should be the debit side because he's a debtor, and on the debit side of the sales account, it should be a credit side because sales has a credit balance. The corrected figure here is double the original figure. So you have to post it once on the opposite side to correct the mistake, and then post it a second time to fix the journal. So the incorrect figure had to be cancelled and the correct figure entered on the correct side. So here are some simple rules for bookkeeping. Drawings have a debit balance. This is money taken out by the owners. Capital is a credit balance, money put in by the owners. If it's a profit and loss item, you debit expenses and you credit income or sales or revenue. If it's a balance sheet item, you debit assets and credit liabilities. And if it's profits, is posted as a credit balance and a loss is posted as a debit balance. So now to look at how we would approach answering the question in the exam. So part A is the first part, and you're asked to journalize the necessary corrections. So this is the main part of the question, and all the other parts are kind of based off this part. So this is where the majority of the work is done, and usually accounts for over half the marks of the total question. So if there's 100 marks in total, usually about 54 marks are for this part. So I would always approach this part of the question by doing T accounts. So for usually you're given 5 kind of transactions or entries that are done wrong, and you have to fix them. So in black pen, I would put the original entry. So whatever they have done, I would put in black pen. If the original journal does not balance, so if you write their journal and if it balances, you won't need a suspense account. If it does not balance, if the original journal does not balance, the difference will go in a suspense account. Then in red pen, I would correct the account. So I'd fix what they have done or do the opposite of what they've done to fix it. And then I would put in the correct entries in red. So all of that I would do in red. It is these entries in red pen that will make up our journal entry. So when we go to make our journals, we pick out the figures in red, we write them out as a journal, and our journal should balance. There should never be a balance left in suspense account after correcting the original entries. So if you have suspense, by the time your journal is done, the suspense balance should be 0. When we write out our finished journals, they must always balance. So when you've written your journals, the debit and credit should always be the same. And under the journal, we must write a quick one-line explanation of what has happened. So something like being debtors incorrectly entered on the debit side of the sales account or something like that. Part B, show the suspense account. So this is only a small part here with a few 2 or 3 or 4 entries maybe. The suspense account is presented as a T account again with a debit and credit side. In the suspense account, we put any of the journal entries from part A that contain suspense. So we go down through our 5 journals from part A. If any of them, if there was an error, we had to have a suspense account and we had to correct that. So we would have had to either debit or credit a suspense to correct that. So from those 5 journals, we pick out anywhere that we see suspense, usually maybe 3 or 4 times out of the 5 journals. Then when we're entering these, they go on the same side of this suspense account as they went on the original journal entry. So in part A, if we were debiting suspense twice and crediting suspense once, it'll be the same here. Debit suspense twice and credit suspense once. Then we add both sides and the difference is put on the smaller side to make a T account balance. So if the total on the debit side is 500 and the total on the credit side is 2,000, then we put in 1,500 on the debit side just to balance the accounts. And that will be our difference. Part C then asks us to prepare a statement showing the corrected net profit. So in this part, we work out what effect the journals we posted in part A would have on our net profit. So we're going back to our 5 journals in part A, and here I would circle any profit and loss items. So anything with sales, purchases, any expenses and so on, I would circle those. Then we start off, in this part, we start off the original net profit as found in the finance by section of the balance sheet. So in the question, you're given a balance sheet, under finance by, you will see net profit. So that's our starting figure. And then we'll go back to the journals, highlight any accounts, as I said, that affect the profit and loss in those 5 journals. If the entry to the journal is on a credit side, we add it to the original net profit. So if we have purchases or sales on the credit side, we'll add it to the original net profit. And if the entry to the journal is on the debit side, we take it away from the original net profit. So if you have sales, purchases, insurance, anything like that on the debit side, we'll take it away from the original net profit because it's going to reduce the profit. Part D then asks us to prepare a corrected balance sheet. So again in this part, we work out what effect the journals posted in part A would have on our balance sheet. So again here we should go back and highlight any accounts that affect the balance sheet in the original 5 journals. So if you see anything like motor vehicles, debtors, creditors, stock, anything like that, I would circle those. Then at this stage, between part B, which was a suspense account, we circled all those. Part C was the profit and loss, we've circled all those. And part D was the balance sheet, when we circled all of those. Then every figure in our journals from part A should be highlighted. We should have used them all at this stage. So back to part D here. If the account affected is an asset, so if you circle all the balance sheet items and it's an asset, something like, let's say, motor vehicles, then assets have a debit balance. So if it is a debit journal entry, you add it to the asset. So if you go back to part A and you see motor vehicles on the debit side, you're going to add it to the asset because it's going to increase the asset. Similarly, if it's on the credit side, we'll take it away from the asset. So if we see motor vehicles on the credit side, that will reduce our assets, so we'll take it away. If the account affected is a liability, so something like creditors, if it's a debit journal entry, we subtract it from the liability because creditors is a liability, is the credit balance. So if it's a debit, if we're debiting creditors in part A, we'll take it away from creditors. And if it's a credit journal entry, we'll add it because liabilities have a credit balance. So if we're crediting creditors, we're going to add it to our creditors balance. So now we're going to have a look at a fully worked out solution to the 2018 Leaving Cert Higher Level Suspense question. So we can see all of this in a real life example.
Hi, today we're going to look at the 2018 Leaving Cert Higher Level Suspense account. As with all suspense accounts, we're given a balance sheet, we're given 5 additional notes of error, and then we are asked to do up the journals, produce a suspense account, a statement of corrected net profit, a corrected balance sheet, and then usually be a small bit of theory at the end. So the main marks go for the journals, but to do these journals we're going to need to do out T accounts for each journal, which is the hard part. Once you have the T accounts done, the journals are easy enough, and once the journals are done, the rest of the question isn't too bad. So the T accounts are the hard part, so that's where we'll start. So we'll go through them one by one. Note number 1 says, and it's important to bear in mind here, the Fatty are a garage owner, the company we're doing, Fatty are a garage owner. So note 1 says, a car lift purchased on credit for 4,000 had been entered on the incorrect side of the creditor's account. The only other entry was a debit of 400 to the purchaser's account. Okay, so for this one here, when they purchased the car lift, they should have debited equipment and they should have credited creditors. Now, they don't debit purchases. While they are a garage owner, the car lift wouldn't be for resale, so it shouldn't be included as a purchase. It is equipment, it's a fixed asset. That's what you should have done. Now, what they did, they put it on the incorrect side of the creditor's account. So instead of crediting creditors, they debited creditors, and then they also debited purchases with 400. So we're going to look at the journals, the T accounts for these now. So the first T account they had was creditors. And whatever entries they made, we're going to put in black, and our fixing entries we're going to put in red, and it's the figures in red we're going to use to make up our journals. So they put it on the wrong side of the creditors account. They should have credited creditors of 4,000, but if they put it on the wrong side, they debited creditors of 400, and the other thing that they did was they debited creditors of 4,000, and the other thing said they did was the debited purchases with 400. This is a one-sided journal, so to balance this out, they must have put the difference into suspense. So they must have credited suspense with 4,400. Now that is wrong, so to fix it, we're just going to do the opposite. I'm going to credit creditors with 4,000. I'm going to credit purchases with 400, and I'm going to debit suspense with 4,400. And now we're going to put in the correct entries. So what they should have done is debit equipment, because the lift wasn't to resell, so it shouldn't be included in purchases, it should be included in equipment. So we're going to debit equipment with 4,000 and credit creditors with 4,000 because they haven't paid for it yet. So that is number 1 complete, and now we have to put these into journals. So my first journal is I'm going to credit creditors with 8,000 in total. I'm going to credit purchases with 400. And again, I'm just taking the figures in red. I'm going to debit Suspense with 4,400. And finally, I'm going to debit equipment with 4,000. And then you should just check that your journal is balanced, so the debit is 8,400 and the credit is 8,400, so that's fine. And then we just put in one single little sentence saying what's going on. So something like, being correction of purchase of car lift incorrectly entered will be fine. On to adjustment number 2 now. It says D. Fahy's private car at 10,000 was presented to the business for resale. Okay, so he's given it to the company, which is introducing capital, and because it's for resale, it should be included in purchases. No entry was made in the books regarding this transaction. The car was later sold on credit to a debtor of the business for 10,000, and this sale had been treated as a cash sale. So it's treated as a cash sale, not a credit sale. Now, while it says it's treated as a cash sale, it doesn't mean it was physically sold for cash. It just means, I think, that it wasn't sold on credit, so it should be included in bank. But to start off with, anyway, the first thing we're going to have to do is put in the entry for the car that was private car that was presented to the business for resale. Because it was presented for resale, it should go in purchases. So I'm going to open up a purchases account. And purchases has a debit balance, and it's gone up by another 10,000. It'll be a debit of 10,000. And then the second account I'm going to have is capital. Now capital has a credit balance, so if he's introducing more capital to the company when he gave the car of 10,000, capital will go up by 10,000. The second part of the question says that the car was later sold on credit to a debtor of the business. It had been treated as a cash sale. So if he treated it as a cash sale, the first thing he would have done is he would have credited sales with 10,000. And then if he treated it as a cash sale, he would have debited bank with 10,000. Because with bank, you debit what comes in, you credit what goes out. Now some people might include that in a cash account, but I think it's probably better in the bank account. Now, it shouldn't have been treated as a cash sale. It was a sale on credit. Okay, so it shouldn't have went into bank. It should have gone into debtors. So I'm going to have to open up a debtors account because I haven't paid for it yet. And I'll credit bank with 10,000 to take it out of bank, and I'm going to debit debtors with 10,000 because that's where it should have went originally, not into bank. Now to do with the journals for this, my first journal is going to be purchases, and that's going to be a debit balance of 10,000. My second journal is going to be, the second entry is going to be capital, and that's going to be a credit balance of 10,000. Sales was okay, so I don't need an entry for that. My next journal is going to be bank, and I'm going to credit bank with 10,000. And again, I'm just taking the figures in red. And the last entry is going to be debtors, and I'm going to debit my debtors with 10,000. And again, just check our journals balance to do debit and credit are both 20,000. And a sentence saying, being recording of capital introduced and correction of credit sale treated as cash sale. Okay, on to entry number 3 now. It says D. Fahy had returned a motor car. Okay, so it's purchases returns we're talking about. Previously purchased on credit from a supplier for 12,000 and entered this transaction in the relevant accounts as 1,200. However, a credit note subsequently arrived from supplier showing a restocking charge of 200. So we were charged a charge of 200 for returning these goods. The only entry made in this respect was a credit note, was a credit entry of 11,800 in the creditors. Okay, so to start at the start anyway, we returned a motor car previously purchased on credit from a supplier for 12,000. This is entered in the relevant ledger accounts incorrectly as 1,200. So we put it in the correct accounts and the correct place, just the wrong amount. So if it's purchases returns, what we're talking about here are purchases / returns account. Some people set up a separate account for purchases returns and some people might include them with purchases. So purchases / returns will be fine, and creditors. Now purchases have a debit balance, so purchases returns would have a credit balance. So what we should have done is credited purchases returns and debited creditors, because if we returned the goods we would owe them less. Now that's what we did do, but we just did it for the incorrect amount. We did it for 1,200. So I credited purchases returns 1,200 and debited creditors with 1,200. So to fix that 1,200 should be 12,000. So to get that to 12,000, I'm going to put in 10,800 here and 10,800 here. And now they are correct, they are 12,000. The second part of the question says, we were charged a restocking charge of €200. So if you get charged a restocking charge or a delivery charge or something like that on purchases returns, you should just treat it like a purchase. If it's on sales returns, you should treat it like a sale. So we should have just debited purchases with 200 and credited creditors with 200. Now what did we do? The only entry we made was a credit entry of 11,800 in the creditors account. So what we did, we put 11,800 in the creditors account. Now we shouldn't have done that, and again it was a one-sided journal, so the other side of that journal must have been suspense. Because you can't enter a one-sided journal. So what he did that, he must have debited suspense with 11,800. So to correct that, I'm just going to credit suspense with 11,800 and I'm going to debit creditors with 11,800 to get rid of that entry. And I'm just going to put in the restocking charge now of €200. And like I said, if you get charged a restocking charge and purchases returns, you just treat it like a purchase. So I'm just going to debit purchases / returns with 200 and I'm going to credit creditors with 200. That is entry number 3 done. So my first journal is going to be purchases / returns. And as the credit side is bigger, it's going to be a credit balance of, if I net these together, 10,800 minus 200 is 10,600. My next entry is going to be creditors. And again, as the debit side is bigger, it's going to be a net debit balance, and it's going to be 10,800 plus 11,800 minus the credit of 200, leaving me with a debit balance of 22,400. And my last journal of suspense is going to be a credit balance of 11,800. And again, we'll just check these balances. If I add these quickly here, I can see that they sum to 22,400, so that's fine. And the sentence says, being correction of purchases, returns and restocking charge entered incorrectly. Entry number 4 now. If I go back to the question, I can see that a payment of 500 was received from F. McFadden, a debtor whose debt had been previously written off and who wishes to trade with Fahy again. This represents 80% of the original debt, and the debtor is undertaken to pay the remainder of the debt by January next year. No entry was made in the books. So basically, he was previously written off as a bad debt, now he's giving us the money back. He gave us 500, which is 80%, so he still owes us the other 20%, and we're going to get it all back, the full 100% in total. So to do up the workings for this, well, the first thing anyway is I received €500. So if you receive money, it's going to go into the bank, and with bank, you debit what comes in and credit what goes out. So if I receive €500, I'm going to debit bank with €500. On the opposite side there, I'm going to have a bad debt recovered account. And that is income. That's good. Bad debt recovered is income, and income is a credit balance. So I'm going to credit that with €500. Now that's 80%. So to get the full amount, I'm going to have to, if I get, just a little working here, 500 divided by 80 multiplied by 100. So the full amount of the debt must have been 625. Because if 500 is 80%, 100% would be 625. Now we're still owed that the remainder, the other 125. So that is owed to us by a debtor. So I'm going to set up a debtors account, and debtors are an asset of a debit balance. And if they owe me 125 more, I'm going to debit debtors with 125. And again, I'm going to credit bad debt recovered with 125 because I'm going to get that. He's promised to give that at the start of next year, so I'm going to get that money also. So now that's the entries finished. I just have to journal these. So my first entry is going to be bank, and bank is going to be a debit of €500. My second entry is going to be bad debt recovered, and bad debt recovered is going to be a credit balance of 500 plus 125, 625. And the last entry here, I'm going to have debtors, and the debtors is a debit balance of 125. And that balances, and the sentence we're going to have are being recording of bad debt recovered and amount still owed. The fifth entry, our last entry, says that DFAT purchases goods on credit from Car Parts Limited for 3,000 plus VAT at 13.5%. The only entries in the accounts where the VAT inclusive figure was entered in the debit side of the equipment account and the VAT exclusive figure entered on the credit side of the parts account. So if he purchased goods on credit, he should have debited purchases with 3,000, debited VAT with the VAT amount, and credited the full amount. That's what he should have done. What he did do is put the VAT inclusive amount, which is the 3,000 plus the VAT, was entered on the debit side of the equipment account, okay, which it shouldn't be. So we're going to have to put that on the debit side of the equipment account, and the VAT exclusive figure, the 3,000, entered on the credit side of Car Parts Limited, which are creditors. Okay, so the first account was the equipment account. Now, the amount was 3,000 plus VAT of 13.5%, and he put the VAT inclusive figure, he debited equipment with that, so it will be 3,000 by 113.5%. The 3,000 plus the 13.5%, so he would have debited equipment with 3,405. Then, and just before I move on, in the last one it said there's no entries made in the books. So if there's no entries made in the books for number 4, these are all going to be read. These are our entries. Okay, so back to this one. He debited equipment with 3,405. He put the VAT exclusive amount, which is the 3,000. He credited creditors with 3,000. And that's the only entries he's put in. Now that again is a one-sided journal that doesn't balance, so he must have put the difference into suspense, and the difference is 405 of a credit. He must have credited suspense with 405. Now that is incorrect, so I'm going to fix that by just doing the opposite. So I'm going to credit equipment with 3,405, debit creditors with 3,000, and debit suspense with 405. And like we said, because that's corrected, so now we have to put in what he should have actually done. So what he should have done, he should have debited purchases with the VAT exclusive figure, debited purchases with the 3,000. He should have debited VAT with 405, because you can claim that back on purchases which would be an asset. So he should have debited VAT with 405, and he should have credited creditors with the full amount, which is 3,405. Okay, so to put these into our journals then, the first account we're going to have is equipment. And equipment is going to be a credit balance of 3,405. Then the second account we're going to have our creditors. And now because the credit side is bigger, it's going to be a net credit balance of 3,405 minus 3,000. Suspense is going to be a debit balance of 405. Purchases is going to be a debit balance of 3,000. and VAT is going to be a debit balance of 405. Again, just to make sure these balance, I'm going to add up the left hand side. You can see it comes to 3810 here, and the right hand side comes to 3810, so my journal's balance. And it's going to say here, being capital introduced for payment of hire of equipment. And again, you have to put in one sentence here just to explain what's going on. And I think I may have just taken that from another question. It may be wrong. Being VAT on purchases. That would be fine. Okay, so that's the journals done, then that's the hard part done. So the journals are done. Now the next thing we're asked to do here, if we go back to the question, the next thing we're asked to do is prepare a suspense account. So to prepare the suspense account, all you have to do is take the suspense figures from your journal. So I'm going to go back to my journals and get the suspense figures, and I'm going to highlight them in yellow. So I have a debit of 4,400 here. I have a debit of credit of 11,800, and I have a debit of 405. So they'll just go into suspense accounts for the same amounts on the same side. So the first one is going to be 4,400. Note 1, just to do with purchases creditors from note 1. The second one is going to be 11,800 of a credit balance. And again, that's to do with creditors and purchases returns from note 3. And the last one here, if I go down to note 5, I also had a suspense journal of 405 of a debit balance here. So now I just add up my bigger side, which is my credit side. That comes to 11,800. My debit balance should also be 11,800. So to get the original difference, it's just going to be 11,800 minus 405 minus 4,400, which gives me 6,995 for my suspense account. Okay, so that's that part done, the suspense account. Part B. Part C says show statement showing the corrected net profit. Okay, so the statement of corrected net profit, the first thing we're going to do is get the original net profit from the question. So I can see here the original net profit is 40,000 euro. Then, with the P&L items in the journals, any P&L items on the right hand side I'm going to add, and on the left hand side I'm going to take away. So if I go back to my journals here, and any P&L items on the right I'm going to add, and the left I'm going to take away. That's because P&L items on the right are good, such as income, and P&L items on the left, expenses, are bad. So I'm going to go down through these and highlight my P&L items first of all. So the first P&L item I have is purchases. I'm going to highlight that in green. They are not P&L. Purchases again is P&L. Capital isn't. Bank isn't. Debtors isn't. Purchases / returns is P&L. Creditors no. Suspense no. Bank. Bad debts recovered is a P&L item. Equipment purchases is a P&L item, and the remainder are balance sheet items. So the ones on the right I'm going to add on. So the purchases / returns of 10,600 I'm going to add on. Sorry, the first one here is note 1. It's the purchases of 400. Then I'm going to take away, if I go down in order, the next one here is the purchases of a balance of 10,000. I'm going to take that away. My next P&L item is a credit balance of 10,600, which I'm going to add on. My next one is a bad debt recovered, which again is a credit balance I'm going to add. The last P&L item is purchases, and it's a debit balance on the left hand side, so I'm going to take that away, 3,000. Okay, so the total I'm going to add on then to my original net profit to increase it is 11,625. So 40,000 plus 11,625 gives me 51,625. And then I'm going to take away 13,000. So 51,625 minus 13,000 gives me 38,625, which is my corrected net profit. And the last, the part D says prepare a corrected balance sheet. Okay, so to do the corrected balance sheet, we're just going to start off with the balance sheet figures from the question, and then we're going to, if there's any journals for those, we have to adjust those figures. So the first thing we're going to look at is premises. Now there's no change to premises from the original question. So premises in the original balance sheet were 500,000, and there was no journals changing that, so they're going to remain at 500,000. There's no depreciation in this question, but in some of the questions there is, so I just left depreciation there as a minus. So the net book value of premises are 500,000. Motor vehicles are the next entry that have to go in. Again, there is no change to motor vehicles, no journals for motor vehicles. They're 35,000 in the original balance sheet, so they will go as 35,000 here. Again, there's no depreciation, and the net book value is 35,000. Now there were changes to equipment. So in the original balance sheet, equipment is 24,000, but I have journals for equipment. I'm going to highlight these just to show that we're using the figures. So with the balance sheet, just to show here, if their assets have a debit balance, so if it's an asset entry and to the left hand side it's going to increase it because they have a debit balance. If it's an asset and to the right hand side it's going to decrease it. And similarly with liabilities, which have a credit balance, if it's a liability and it's a credit entry, it's going to increase the liability. If it's a liability and it's a debit balance, it's going to decrease the liability. So this equipment is a debit balance of 4,000, so that's going to increase my asset of 4,000, and then I have a credit equipment here of 3,405, which will reduce my asset. So I'm going to add the 4,000 and I'm going to take away the 3,405. So 24,000, add the 4,000 because it's a debit entry, and take away 3,405 because it's a credit entry. So in total, my equipment is now 24,595. And I'm going to just add these down, which will leave you with total fixed assets of 55,559,595. The next thing I have to do are my current assets. So if I go back again to my original balance sheet, there was no change to closing stock, so that's still going to be 60,500. There were a couple of entries for debtors. So debtors in the original balance sheet is 10,800. Now, if I go back and look at my journals to have a look at the debtors, I debited debtors with 10,000. And again, debtors is an asset, so his debit balance is going to increase it by 10,000. And here it's also a debit balance of 125, so it's going to increase it by 125. So I'm going to add the 10,000 and add the 125. So it's 10,800 originally, plus the 10,000 debit entry, plus the 125 debit entry, and that is going to leave me with 20,925. And there was no change to cash from the original balance sheet. So if I look at cash in my original balance sheet, it was 12,200, so that's going to remain at 12,200, and that will leave me with total current assets of 93,625. Now the creditors amounts due within 1 year is creditors. Okay, so there's been a few changes to creditors in the journals, and we also have to remember that suspense is included in creditors. So originally creditors was 52,300. if I look at my original balance sheet, it was 52,300. Now, if I go to my journals and look at the creditors changes, there's a credit entry of 8,000, and again, creditors have a credit balance, it's a liability, so that 8,000 is going to increase my liability. I'm going to add the 8,000. I'm going to take away the 22,400 because it's a debit entry, and I'm going to add the 405 because it's a credit entry. Now, also the suspense was included in creditors. So the original difference in suspense was a debit balance. So to fix that, we must have put in a credit balance of 6995. So if we put in the credit balance of 6995 into the creditors account, it's going to increase creditors by 6995. So I'm going to start off with the 52,300 from the original balance sheet. I'm going to add the 8,000 credit balance. I'm going to take away the 22,400 debit balance. I'm going to add the 405 credit balance, and I'm going to add the error, the original error from suspense that we had to fix. We had to credit the suspense originally, which would increase my creditors account by 6995. This comes to 45,300. Bank overdraft. Bank overdraft originally was 18,400, and again there were some journals for bank, so we have to account for those. So bank overdraft is a liability, which is a credit balance, so that credit 10,000 is going to increase my overdraft, so I'm going to add that 10,000, and I'm going to take away that 500 because the debit balance will reduce it. So I'm going to add, my original bank overdraft is 18,400. I'm going to add the 10,000 credit. I'm going to take away the 500 debit. So that's my bank done. And the last thing I have to do here is my VAT. So the VAT originally was 7,500, and that's a credit balance. It's a VAT liability. So this 405 here will reduce that liability by 405 euro. So I'm going to take that 405 euro away. So 7,500 minus 405 leaves me with 7,095 for VAT. Okay, so now I'm just going to add these liabilities to within 1 year, and they come to 8295. My current assets minus my liabilities less than 1 year will give me a working capital of 13,330, and I'm going to add that to my fixed assets above, which give me total net assets of 572,925. Now just to finish off the bottom of the balance sheet, first thing is financed by. Now the capital in the original question was 550,000, and again capital is a credit balance, it's money that owed back to the owners, so it's 550,000. So if I go to my journals, I have one journal for capital of 10,000 here, which is a credit journal, so that's going to increase my capital by 10,000 euro. So originally it was 550,000, it's going to increase by 10,000, which will bring it to 560,000. My net profit, I'm just going to take from the previous part of the question, my new corrected net profit. So I'm going to add those. And I'm going to take away the drawings of 25,700. Now there's no change to drawings in this question, so they remain the same as the original balance sheet. And that leaves me with 572,925. And that is the suspense.